All right. Welcome to Military Images Live. This is Ron Coddington, the editor of Military Images. Delighted to be here tonight on Memorial Day, a solemn occasion where we remember all the fallen from the wars that we have been in the past, and of course the war that we're currently fighting now, the war against the coronavirus. So our thoughts and hearts go out to all those on the front lines right now in the coronavirus. Of course, our hearts and thoughts go out to all of those who have died in combat and died in the military in wartime and elsewhere. And while we're waiting for folks to join us, I see Kevin Canberg is on. Hey, Kevin, Rich, right behind him. Rich, how are you doing tonight? I'm so glad you can make it. Rick is here. Thanks, Rick. Michael Pissarro is here. How's it going, Michael? While we're waiting for more folks to come on, I want to put in a good word for Everett Bowles at Civil War Badges. Everett is someone that I see at almost every Civil War show that I attend. And as I think about Gettysburg, the Gettysburg show being canceled for this year, I think about folks like Everett and other dealers who advertise in Military Images, who do their very best to bring quality images and other artifacts to the hobby for us to be the caretakers of. And so I want to put in a good word for Everett. If you haven't visited his website, civilwarbadges.com, I urge you to go check it out. So I also want to mention the next issue of Military Images magazine. In fact, the files were sent to the printer this morning, and when the fine folks at Chroma Graphics come into work tomorrow, they'll have the magazine to get started on. I wanted to tease you just a little bit. If you're a subscriber, great. If you're not, this is a perfect time to subscribe. I want to give you a couple of keywords for the summer issue. 4th of July, 1860. General John Reynolds, Jubal Early's headquarters flag. Gettysburg Gallery, 20th Maine, 13th Mississippi. Iron Brigade, Children of the Battlefield, Old Abe, and Magic Lantern slides. Just a little bit of what you're going to find in the next issue. I haven't even mentioned all the departments that we have. Behind the backdrop, fakes, photo sleuth. Got about 10, 11 columns right now. So again, if you're a subscriber, thank you for your support, and I really appreciate it. If you are thinking about subscribing, now is the perfect time to do it. Go to shopmilitaryimages.com, and here's my tip for the evening. Use the promo code Photo Collector to get 25%. That's for new subscribers only. So, also, a bit of news to pass along. The Civil War Photo Collectors Society, which is Military Images and Civil War Faces, has been planning an African American exhibit to be held in York, Pennsylvania at the Goodrich House. It's one of the images that will be in the show from the Paul Rusinoff collection. We had scheduled the show for July 11th. However, considering where we are in the phasing in of getting back to an active life and getting back out in public, July 11th is too ambitious. So we're not going to cancel the event. We're going to postpone it until 2021. So we'll be in touch with more details about that. So I wanted you to know that you may not see it advertised, or you won't see it advertised. And if you don't, you'll know why. So also want to mention, in the spirit of positive news, things that are going on and continue to go on. Caretakers, which is Military Images, Civil War Faces under the auspices of the Civil War Photo Collector Society. That show continues. That's our weekly show, Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. Very popular. Many of you have contacted me and contacted Doug York to say how much you appreciate it, and we're delighted. And the next 4 shows, Rick Brown, Jason Pate, Joe Maghe, and Ron Field coming up. So if you're interested in participating, we've got, I think, 10 episodes, 9 or 10 episodes on YouTube right now. Go to the Military Images channel on YouTube and you'll find the playlist. And you can watch Craig James, who was our most recent collector, to share his collection and share his knowledge. He was up last Saturday. So the following 4 weeks, we've got him mapped out. If you want to get on the list, definitely let me know, and or let Doug know, and we'll make it happen. So just so you're aware, Military Images, we sort of have, we've got a lot going on, reaching out. Our goal, our motto, as you know, is to showcase, interpret, and preserve. And part of the way we do that, of course, a big way, is through the magazine. But there are other ways in partnerships and other activities that we're part of. And so Caretakers, which I just talked about at the top of the list here, is one of them. There's also Civil War Photo Sleuth, which we're a partner with Kurt Luther, Kurt Luther and Virginia Tech. And then we have co-branded partnerships with the Civil War Monitor and the Civil War Navy magazine. And then, of course, our Facebook friends, Civil War Faces, Doug York, the Image Collector, Dale Neeson. Check out the Favorite Photo collection that Dale is working on now, which will appear in a future issue of the magazine. And then, of course, the Civil War Photo Collector Society. So there's sort of a big reach that Military Images has to get out the good word about the photos that we collect. So enjoy all of that, and appreciate your support and all you're doing to be an active member of the Civil War photo collecting community. So thank you. Now, I'm going to get started with a story that, in the spirit of sharing and the spirit of remembering, I want to share a story that that touched me in the work that I've done and the profiles that I've written. I thought that I would talk about a soldier story, a soldier and his story that that touched me when I wrote it some years ago. And the title is "The Day the Stars Wept," and you'll find out why as you listen. So this is George Washington Quimby of the 4th Vermont Infantry. And to set the stage for you, I want to take you to Fredericksburg, Battle of Fredericksburg, second day, December 13th, 1862. The sun is slipping below the horizon, and twilight is beginning to come on. It's been a tough day for the 4th Vermont. They're now on the skirmish line. Throughout the day, they have taken casualties. In battle, they've lost about 50 wounded and killed, 18 killed and wounded in one blast of a Confederate canister into their ranks. So it's been a long, difficult day. And these guys have held up well. So most of them are laying down on the ground at this point. And the battlefield in front of them, dead horses, soldiers that are dead and wounded, debris scattered all around. And as the night is beginning to fall, you can see slight movement across the battlefield of the men as they're injured. You can hear the cries, you can hear the groans, a very poignant moment, and one that the Vermonters can't do much about because there's still scattered gunfire going on. George is standing up amongst his men. He's an interesting guy. He's a Dartmouth graduate, but he's endeared himself to the men. He was a school teacher. In fact, when he graduated from Dartmouth, he had a dream, and his dream was to help others. And he wanted to do that by education. He wanted to be an educator. So he went down to Georgia to become a teacher. And in late 1859, around the time of the John Brown trial and events leading up to the trial and John Brown's actions at Harper's Ferry, made the climate in Georgia not particularly good for someone from up in Vermont, Linden, Vermont, by the way, like George. And so he writes a letter, and he talks about some of the challenges he had. And he said, "I came here expecting to teach in Georgia, but it being a little after that, the Harper's Ferry affair, some of the trustees of the school would have nothing to do with a Northerner. So I was shafted, and it was impossible to secure a school here right now." He added, "It's not safe for a Northerner to go into what he called small places. They're likely to have vigilante commissions in nearly all such places. And they're likely to drive a man from a place without a word as any other way." George abandoned his dream, and he went back up to Linden, Vermont. And he went to school, this time as a principal, in a neighboring town of Barton, and did, by all accounts, a great job as being principal, inspiring young students. When the war came, he didn't get involved at first, those heady days after Fort Sumter. He didn't get into one of the 3-a-month regiments, but he eventually did on July 4th, an auspicious day, July 4th, 1861. He joins the 4th as a lieutenant, and he distinguishes himself pretty early on. His captain resigns, and he soon becomes captain. In the Peninsula Campaign, he really does himself quite a bit of credit, and the men come to really appreciate him for his courage. He also makes his mother proud. His mother writes about the Peninsula Campaign of Virginia. "Here he exhibited the courage of a true soldier, and for all his coolness and bravery in the hour of fearful danger, he was recommended for promotion as major." That's about that time. He sits for this photograph. You can see him here. He's sitting with a hand on his knee in camp with some of his company officers, Sibley tent in the background. And gentleman over here, Charles Kinsman, is going to play an important role. So I want to flag him for your attention. Before the year's end, they're at Fredericksburg. Fighting is going on. I told you about the situation on December 13th. Quimby, George, is up standing. He's telling everybody to lay low, keep low. The shots are firing around him. Somewhere on the other side of the battlefield, a Confederate soldier, the sharpshooter. Twilight is coming on. It's maybe beginning difficult to see. But that sharpshooter can see. He takes aim, fires his weapon, and a bullet strikes Quimby. It hits him in the neck, in the jugular vein, and he really didn't know what hit him. Charles Kinsman, the officer pictured here, was sitting on the ground following his commander's orders to lay down. He was sitting next to Quimby as Quimby was standing. And he wrote about what happened. He said, "I was sitting beside him, also the first sergeant." You can assume the first sergeant may have been sitting on the other side of him. "We caught him before he fell to the ground." You see that shot in the jugular vein. The blood came out, soaked his uniform, soaked his neck. And Charles says, fell to the ground. He never spoke. And I think from the time he was struck, never realized anything. George Quimby, fell down to the ground into the arms of Charles Kinsman. And George was gone. Kinsman and a few other soldiers managed to get George's body to a hospital and wanted to begin the process of taking charge of his remains to be sent back home. About that time, it was a Confederate attack, and they had to suspend their plans. So instead of leaving the body at the hospital, they buried it in a hasty ground burial, threw some dirt on top of his remains. Eventually, the Confederate attack was pushed back, and they went and retrieved the remains, took them to an embalmer, got them cleaned up, got them on a train to go back to Linden, Vermont. Meanwhile, the family was notified, and the loss of George affected them, as you might imagine, affected them to the depths of their souls. George's brother Moses kept a diary. There's 2 entries I want to read to you, or parts of 2 entries. Moses talks about arriving at his father's house about 7 o'clock in the evening one night. He says, "What a solemn meeting it was. How we wept for our dear friend, laid low by the hound of treason. How grateful we felt to have the body and enjoy the sad privilege of looking upon the ever pleasant and manly countenance. Now cold in death, Captain George Washington Quimby is no more." They had the funeral soon after, and Brother Moses describes that. His funeral took place on the 24th at the Free Will Baptist House, where large numbers met to weep with those who weep and pay their last respects at departed worth. Our national flag, with its stars and stripes, hung over the pulpit and on the opposite walls, cold in mourning, with its stars weeping over the lifeless remains of the brave man laid low in death by rebellion, while appropriate mottos, Linden weeps for her son, and Barton mourns a friend and officer, adjoining 2 beautiful flags, one at each end of the coffin. They told how highly the deceased was esteemed. Back in Virginia, Charles Kinsman, still in mourning, wrote a note to Quimby's sister, Emmeline. He said, really a reply. He said, "I can fully sympathize with you in all your affliction, as I come to look at him more like a brother than anything else. And I truly mourn for him, a friend forever lost to me." Here's a picture of Charles. He went on to live a life. In 1886, folks at the Grand Army of the Republic, up in his neck of the woods in Vermont, established a GAR post, and of course they named it for George Washington Quimby. Charles lived until 1903. So that's the story of George Washington Quimby, somebody that I'm remembering today. Now, let's take a little trip down the research rabbit hole. I'm going to start with this photograph. I have a soldier wearing looks like full gear, standing in front of a monument and leaning his hand on the monument. It's a remarkably clear photograph. Take a look at the detail. You can see he's still crystal clear after 155 years or so. Has his arm resting on the marble, and you can see on some of the engraving here says died of disease up top. You can pretty clearly read that, and some names that are very difficult to read, and some other engraving across the bottom. First, you got to think, where is this? So fortunately, there's a back mark. There's no identification, but there's a back mark. E.Crew's Art Palace on Main Street in Alliance, Ohio. Didn't take me long to find the cemetery right in downtown, the City of Alliance Cemetery. There's a monument there. And if you go to the historical marker database, you can see the photograph right here. Here's that same monument. Now it's got a plaque in front of it. It's a memorial for sure. And here's one of the sides of that monument. Turns out there's engraving on all four sides of the base of that memorial. And if you look at this book, you'll find out by a man named Rexford G. Wiggers. It's the history of the 115th Ohio Infantry. It's a nicely done book. Rexford talks about the 115th in a number of newspaper articles as well. Clearly is well versed in the subject. And in fact, at one point, you all will appreciate this, he talks about going into antique stores in Alliance and being able to find original photographs of soldiers of the 115th still available for sale in the antique stores. I'll erase you there. I'll bet they're gone, though. Now, the memorial is dedicated to 22 soldiers from Company F of the 115th who perished during the war. 8 of those guys died on a single event, and that was the explosion of the Sultana. I don't think I really even have to tell you guys much about it. April 27th, 1865, the boilers exploded, and the loss of life was catastrophic. 2,137 passengers and crew on a boat that was supposed to hold, I think, about 365. Most of the folks on the ship were soldiers returning from war. The range of dead is a great range. From my research, between 931 and 1,547. There's estimates even higher that even more than a 2,137 on the steamboat itself. Current research lists the losses at 969. So those 8 men from Company F who died on the Sultana: Thomas Rue, William H. Smith, Benjamin H. Crew, Charles W. Dietrich, Adam Hendricks, Alexander Laffeter, Robert Roth, Thomas Spencer. Remember the third name that I mentioned, Benjamin H. Crew. Now, remember the name of the photographer, E. Crew. Seems like there's probably a relationship there. And in fact, there is. I was able to find it in a publication called Military Images Magazine, of all places. Timothy Brooks writes his story, Sunshine to Greenbacks, which is a quote in here about how Emmor, E-M-M-O-R, Emmor Crew, is a successful businessman in the photography industry, and it goes on to do other things. Emmor is the subject of Tim's article written quite a few years ago in Military Images, but it includes photographs that maybe he picked up at some of the antique stores in Alliance. I don't know. But if you go to page 2 of that article, down here in the bottom, you see a picture of Emmor's brother. This is Benjamin, or Ben. So we know what Ben looked like. We don't know what Emmor looked like. At least we don't know yet. But he did leave behind quite a legacy. It's an opera house that he builds, and then it falls down. He eventually goes to Texas and he lives out his life there. He lives a long life. He dies in 1918. And the 1933 newspaper that publishes a story by Emore's daughter, her name is Eva. And Eva tells a story about Emore being a good friend of Abraham Lincoln, and relates the story about Lincoln as he's coming through Ohio on his way to the inaugural in 1861. And so the story goes, Emore Crew finds Lincoln on a train and tries to get him to come out and say a few words. Now, keep in mind, this is oral family history being passed down and recorded some 50 years after the event by a family member as told to a reporter. So the story goes, Lincoln replied to Crew, "I hadn't planned to do this." Crew, of course, says, "Hey, you're going to disappoint folks who were all lined up here to see you." And Lincoln consents to do it. Emore leads the way, and Abraham Lincoln reaches the platform, and of course, in his very Abraham Lincoln way, says, "My friends, if I were to stop at every station between here and Washington and make a speech, I would be several days too late to the inauguration." With that, he smiles and says farewell. And then his daughter Eva says that Emore had a meal with Lincoln. Now, if you go look at the newspapers from 1861, you'll find that there is actually a write-up about Lincoln visiting Alliance. And it doesn't provide nearly the level of detail that Eva has passed along in her family story. And it doesn't mention Emore Crew by name, but it does say that Lincoln stopped, had a few remarks, and also that he ate there. So the basic facts of the two stories line up. Emore Crew might have been the person who really did, according to daughter Eva, coax Abraham Lincoln out onto the platform and then had some food afterwards. Now, back to the Sultana. Interesting. Such a big event, and one that is, it's people know it, but it's not quite as remembered as you might think for such a massive disaster. I went onto newspapers.com just to get a sense of how many times it was mentioned so I can get some perspective of how important it was at the time. So I did a search for certain keywords in May 1865, and you'll see Abraham Lincoln, 2,476 mentions, General Grant, 1,574, General Lee, 902. Here's a Sultana, 858 mentions. The Grand Review gets 670. John Wilkes Booth, surprising to me, 300. And Appomattox, another surprise, only 164 mentions. So the assassination, the surrendered Appomattox, even the Grand Review, which had happened late in the month, getting some lesser references. The Sultana, which happened in late April, as I mentioned, still in May, is getting a large number of mentions. Of course, not as much as Grant, Lee, and Abraham Lincoln. Now, if you go visit, go down to Arkansas, you can go visit the Sultana Disaster Museum. And so that got me to looking around to try to get a sense of how exactly is the Sultana disaster remembered. And I was a little surprised to find that there's a fair number of memorials. The one that maybe most people will know is in Knoxville, Tennessee, which is not far from where the disaster occurred. Here's a better view of the memorial. The first one was a close-up. I wanted you to see the very nice engraving of the ship. You've got in Cincinnati, near where the Sultana was built, you've got this plaque, which is a tribute to what they claim is 791 Ohioans that died on the Sultana. In light of recent research, I'm not sure that number is correct, but still, they've got it on the plaque. We have in Memphis, You've got a memorial to the Sultana. Hillsdale, Michigan. You've got this memorial to 200, the number they have, 280 Michiganders who lost their lives on the Sultana. Here's one for those of you who go to the Mansfield show, Richland County, Ohio. You've got a plaque to the 73 men from the 102nd Ohio Infantry who were on the Sultana. And then here's another one, Muncie, Indiana. 55 men from the 9th Indiana Cavalry who lost their lives on the Sultana. So you've got a lot. And I didn't even get into all the individual monuments, memorials that mention the Sultana, but a good representation. And then, of course, here's another image of the Company F 115th Ohio Monument. I haven't really done the research to determine if it's the earliest Civil War monument, but according to records, it was put up in 1865. And since the sinking itself, the explosion and sinking, happened on April 27th of 1865, there's a period of months there between the end of the year where that might have happened. So it may not be the first, but it certainly is a very early monument to commemorate Civil War soldiers. Now, the thing that really kind of surprised me, even more than the memorials, was how it's remembered in art. And I was kind of shocked, actually. Even today, there is still art being created around the Sultana. So you're not finding maybe as many memorials and monuments that are being erected today, but certainly it's being remembered in art. And it falls into two categories. The first one is the actual steamboat that's on fire. And this is, I believe this is Harper's Weekly or Leslie's, one of the illustrated news magazines of the time. This engraving, this depiction of the wind sweeping the flames across the decks, the fire coming out of the smokestacks, the smoke coming out, the lighting up of the sky, all of the men floating in the water. You see this over and over and over again in years to come. So this single engraving set the tone for much of the artwork that has come since. Here's a perfect example. This almost, at first glance, it almost seems to be a literal copy of what you see. It's the same flames and smoke, not quite the same wind, but you've got the smoke and all that coming on. Then you've got one which appears in a YouTube video, Worse Than Titanic. This is actually picking up on a theme that you see on several of the memorials that talk about the death toll on the Sultana being greater than a Titanic. Apparently not quite true, but still, you've got this sort of this Art Deco kind of a look where the Sultana is portrayed in a 1930s, 40s kind of a feel. So there's that. Now, another interesting piece, this I believe goes to a high school, maybe a high school teacher, if I recall. This seems to be, it's the moment of impact. And this is the only image I could find that has this evening sky, and you can see the explosion just coming off of the side. The rest of the ship appears to be completely intact. There's no flames. The roaring flames coming out the side has not happened yet. There's no flame coming yet out of the smokestacks, but you can see the reflection of the explosion getting caught off of the glint of those metal smokestacks. So the sky is lighting up from the explosion. And then you've got this image, which is sort of another moment of impact, maybe a moment and a little bit more. You can see a wall of flame is erupting between the side wheel steam covering and the rest of the ship. The rest of the ship, it looks like it's being lit up by the flame, and the side wheel, the paneling, is actually coming detached from the ship itself. Folks are already in the water. So the thinking here is maybe the fire has started, it's now burning out of control. folks have fled the ship, and now you get this boiler explosion, and you're about to have the whole side of this wheel fall into the water and perhaps land on some of the men. Now, there's a whole second genre, a whole second classification, perhaps you might call it, of Sultana images. And this is the Sultana before the explosion. And in fact, I found more images of the Sultana before the explosion and then the explosion itself. And all of those images date after, in some cases, long after the explosion. So you've got this image. This is sort of the first in the series. I didn't put them in order by date. It's more of an order of what happened. So you've got this image, and I think this may actually come from the museum in Arkansas, where you've got the ship is on the dock. You've got folks all along the top deck, the side decks, and there's a gangplank with more folks, more soldiers walking on. So this is clearly getting ready to leave on that fateful trip. Here's one where you've got the Sultana appears to be moving out of the harbor. There is a tugboat here moving aside. The ship is now headed out. Here's another one, the ship, the artist Ken Lee, and this is from, it looks like 1997. You've got the ship out in open waters. Looks like smooth sailing for everyone. You've got this. It's a rather primitive drawing, I think done by a child, again, out on the open water. Everything looks to be fine. I think this might be the beginning of the explosion, but I'm not quite sure. But here is the Sultana. You've got the Sultana moving in the nighttime. The moon, it's either, it looks like it's maybe the moon is rising, and you can see the glow coming off of the water. It's reflecting off of the side wheel. All systems seem to be fine. This beautiful image, which is of all the images in this class, it's really my favorite. 1912, the artist is Henderson. It's this sort of moody portrait of the ship moving out, very atmospheric, really quite lovely. And then this image, which is a print that's for sale, and you've got the ship, the Sultana, moving into the distance. The smoke is now coming out towards us. And of course, the Sultana is moving into a date with destiny. So that one photograph got me started on this journey, and I was happy to share with you tonight. And that's it for this episode. So I want to thank you for tuning in. I trust that you've had a safe and thoughtful observance of Memorial Day. We'll be back with another show. Thanks again for tuning in, for all your support, and we'll see you the next time on Military Images Live. Have a great night.